Welcome to Hardly, where each book is distilled into a chronological story, offering you a special journey in just minutes. Today, we study together Alan Taylor's American Civil Wars, A Continental History, 1850-1873, in which we probe into the interconnectedness of multiple civil wars across North America during the same period and how they shaped the future of nations, not just the United States. Alan Taylor chairs the Thomas Jefferson Foundation in the History Department at the University of Virginia. Don't go away. Hurdley, the editor, will be right back with the story. Picture a vast, unsettled land in the mid-1800s, where the dream of freedom collides with deep-rooted divisions. America, at the time, was a nation held together by a fragile bond, one that was increasingly strained by the very principles it claimed to uphold. The land was fertile, bustling with growth and expanding rapidly, but beneath the surface, cracks were already forming. On one side, there were the free states where industry flourished, cities grew, and workers thrived in a rapidly evolving society. But in the South, another world existed, a world built on the labor of enslaved black people, where cotton was king and slaveholders wielded enormous power. These two worlds were bound by an uneasy partnership, and the question of whether slavery would spread into new territories loomed large. By the 1850s, Americans were beginning to realize that this divide could not last forever. One of the key figures in this era was Henry Clay, who, in 1839, warned that if the Union were to rupture, it would lead to desolated fields, conflagrated cities, murdered inhabitants, and the overthrow of the fairest fabric of human government that ever rose to animate the hopes of civilized man. His words echoed like a thunderstorm on the horizon, signaling the growing tension between North and South. Fugitive slaves played a crucial role in this tension. They were not just fleeing to escape the brutal conditions of bondage, but also symbolized the deep moral conflict tearing at the nation's heart. Their stories of desperate flight and pursuit became emblematic of the broader struggle over human freedom. In the 1850s, the infamous Fugitive Slave Act only intensified this drama, forcing free states to return escaped slaves to their southern masters. Imagine the fear and uncertainty that gripped communities when a fugitive slave appeared on their doorstep, seeking safety in a land that promised freedom but could just as easily send them back into chains. The storm was not only one of individuals and laws but of competing destinies. Would America remain a union of states, each free to decide its own fate? Or would a stronger national identity emerge, one that unified the country under a single set of principles? As abolitionists in the North grew louder and Southern voices became more defensive, the divide seemed unbridgeable. It was a time when nothing on earth is settled under this Constitution, as Clay had said, leaving Americans uncertain of their future. The environment of the mid-1800s was not just about slavery, but about expansion. The West, newly opened by railroads and telegraphs, beckoned settlers. The debate about whether these new lands would allow slavery became a flashpoint for the nation's future. The expansion fueled the notion that if the balance of free and slave states tipped too far in one direction, the entire country would spiral into chaos. As this part of the story closes, it's clear that the stage was set for conflict. The lives of individuals, both powerful and powerless, intertwined with larger national concerns, and the seeds of disunion were firmly planted. Fugitive slaves, divided political visions, and the rush for Western expansion all contributed to the gathering storm. But these events were only the beginning. As the years passed and the situation escalated, Americans would face the reality of disunion and the bloodshed that followed. The thunder in the distance was about to break into a full storm as the nation moved toward war. By 1861, the rumblings of conflict had transformed into a full-blown rupture. The United States, once a fragile union of states, was now officially fractured. The South had seceded, forming the Confederate States of America, and the North, led by Abraham Lincoln, was determined to preserve the Union. It was the beginning of one of the darkest periods in American history, a time when neighbors became enemies and the nation was soaked in blood. Imagine the scene: soldiers from both sides, many of them farmers, merchants, and young boys barely out of school, marching off to fight. For some, it was about defending their homeland. For others, it was about preserving a way of life. The disunion, though political, had deeply personal roots for those involved. Men fought not just for their governments, but for their identities. "We fight for our homes," was the cry that echoed across southern states, but the North saw itself as battling for the soul of the nation. As war broke out, both sides were unprepared for the sheer brutality they were about to face. The early years of the Civil War were filled with confusion and chaos, as neither the Union nor the Confederacy could manage the complexities of such a large-scale conflict. Military tactics from the past were suddenly obsolete in the face of new technology. Ironclad ships, rifles, and the telegraph transformed the battlefield into something far more destructive than anyone could have imagined. In 1862, the bloody Battle of Shiloh, where nearly 24,000 men fell, was a grim reminder that this war was not going to be a quick or easy victory for either side. The miseries of war extended far beyond the battlefield. Civilians faced starvation, disease, and the loss of everything they had built. In the South, as Union troops advanced, entire towns were leveled and homes destroyed. Women and children, left behind as their husbands and fathers went to fight, were forced to fend for themselves. "The miseries of this war," one Confederate soldier wrote home, "cannot be expressed in words, and no one will ever understand unless they lived it." The West, too, was drawn into this national conflict. With the war distracting the Union and the Confederacy, Native American tribes found themselves caught in the middle of violent invasions and retaliations. Their land was once again threatened by expanding settler populations, and the United States continued to push westward, even in the midst of its internal strife. While both sides faced internal revolutions in their leadership and tactics, the war's grim reality was that even the boldest strategies could not shield anyone from the cost of lives. By 1863, the Emancipation Proclamation had not only declared freedom for enslaved people in the rebelling states, but also reframed the war as a fight for human rights. This shift added a new layer of urgency, not only for the Union but also for the Confederacy, which now fought not just for independence, but for the preservation of slavery. As the war dragged on, international players watched closely. European powers, including Britain and France, hesitated to intervene directly, but their decisions were influenced by the outcome of this continental struggle. The potential for outside involvement, particularly in the form of invasions or support for one side or the other, loomed as another threat hanging over the divided nation. In this second chapter of America's story, the thunder of disunion had given way to the storm of war. The clash between North and South, between ideologies and destinies, would forever alter the nation. But as the cannons roared and the armies clashed, it became clear that this conflict would be about more than just preserving or dissolving a union. It was reshaping the future of freedom itself. With the end of the war drawing closer, the nation would soon have to face an even more complex challenge: how to heal the deep wounds left behind and rebuild a shattered country. The war may have ended on the battlefield, but the real test was only beginning. The question now was, how would America handle the consequences of this disunion, and how would it reconstruct its future? The war had left the United States in ruins, both physically and emotionally. In 1865, when the guns finally fell silent, the real work began. The battlefield victories and losses had settled the immediate question of union, but they had not resolved the deep divisions that would shape the country's future. The process of reconstruction was daunting, as a shattered nation struggled to rebuild its political, social, and moral fabric. The post-war elections were a key turning point. In the North, the Republican Party gained strength, pushing for a vision of the country where the ideals of freedom and equality could become a reality. But the South was not so easily reconciled. For many who had fought for the Confederacy, the war had not ended in the mind. Defeat in battle did not mean surrender of beliefs. The elections of 1868 brought Ulysses S. Grant to the presidency, a former Union general determined to enforce the new laws of the land. But even under Grant's leadership, the push for change was slow and painful. One of the most challenging aspects of Reconstruction was the reintegration of the South. Former Confederate states were expected to rejoin the Union, but on what terms? The South's economy, based almost entirely on slavery, was in ruins. Plantations had been destroyed, and the enslaved were now free, but that did not mean they were accepted as equal citizens. For years, Black Americans faced brutal violence, economic exclusion, and disenfranchisement. The Reconstruction Amendments, the 13th, 14th, and 15th, promised freedom, citizenship, and voting rights, but enforcing these laws in the South was another matter entirely. As one Southern politician famously put it, "We have lost the war, but we will win the peace." At the same time, the borders of the nation were being redrawn. The West, which had been a peripheral part of the war, now became a central focus of expansion. Native American tribes, already under pressure, faced new threats as settlers pushed into their territories with even more determination. Across the continent, borders were not just physical lines but markers of deeper struggles between cultures, economies, and visions for the future. In the North, industrialization surged ahead. The war had shifted the balance of economic power, and cities like Chicago, New York, and Philadelphia became engines of growth. The South, meanwhile, was left in a state of paralysis. Its reliance on an outdated agricultural system had been its undoing, and now, in the late 1860s and early 1870s, it was unclear how it would ever catch up to the rapidly modernizing North. As the 1870s unfolded, it became clear that the process of Reconstruction was not just about laws or borders, it was about identity. The United States was no longer the same country it had been in 1860. The sleeping giant, as some called it, was beginning to stir, but it was unclear what kind of nation it would become. Would it live up to its promise of freedom and equality for all, or would it retreat into the same divisions that had nearly destroyed it? Looking ahead, the implications of the Civil War and its aftermath were not limited to the United States alone. The war had reshaped the continent. Mexico, embroiled in its own civil war during this period, looked to the north with both hope and fear. In Canada, the war prompted a reflection on the fragile nature of their own unity. The borders may have held, but the future of North America was uncertain. When a nation's internal struggle, such as the American Civil War, erupts, it doesn't just affect that nation's future, it sends shockwaves across an entire continent. The war between North and South transformed not only the United States, but also influenced Mexico's fight against French occupation and Canada's path to unity. The post-war Reconstruction tested whether deep divisions could be mended or if they would leave lasting scars. These interconnected struggles show how internal conflicts reshape nations and their neighbors in unexpected ways. As the editor of Hardly, through learning these lessons, we may come to realize that the future depends on how we choose to rebuild after conflict, not just physically, but in spirit and identity, where every step toward unity must be intentional. As we've explored the journey of conflict, disunion, and reconstruction, it becomes clear that the American Civil War wasn't an isolated struggle. It was deeply connected to the broader continental and global context, where multiple nations were grappling with their own forms of civil unrest. One vivid story that stands out is the invasion of Mexico by the French in 1862, a direct result of the chaos in the United States. With the Union distracted by its own internal war, French Emperor Napoleon III saw an opportunity to install a monarchy in Mexico, propping up the Austrian Archduke Maximilian as emperor. Mexican liberals, however, led by Benito Juárez, resisted fiercely. The French-backed regime would eventually collapse, but not without years of bloody conflict. This invasion underscored the vulnerability of North America in the face of global powers and the interconnected nature of civil wars across the continent. This story illustrates the key argument from the beginning of our journey. The Civil War was not simply an American struggle but a continental one, shaping the futures of Mexico, Canada, and the United States. By the time the dust settled, the fate of republicanism and slavery had been tested not just within the borders of the U.S., but across North America. In the end, we are reminded that the choices made during times of upheaval ripple across borders, affecting the identity and future of entire nations, often in ways that are unexpected and enduring.